we must move to the next presentation. So thank you very much, Jenny. And I will comment in the comment section because I have some more comments. Yeah, so thank you very much once again. And we go to the next presentation from Carrie Hall from the City University of New York. Her research focuses on attention and literacy learning. So the title of the presentation is The Boredoms, Learning Under Duress. So the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes. Yeah.
Hi.
Please.
Hi, thanks. You can see the presentation, correct? Yeah. I've changed the title just slightly because I've sort of started talking about some things that I think they're going to fit nicely, but I'm talking about student metacognitive awareness of boredom. So I've started thinking about boredom in the classroom. So what I'm going to be talking about here is a little bit like, what do we do so I've been teaching about 15 years. I teach at the largest public university, the largest city university in the United States, the City University of New York. I teach at one of our campuses, which is the New York City College of Technology in downtown Brooklyn. And so I often, whenever I think about a problem, I think, well, okay, great. What happens what am I going to do about it? What am I going to do with my students? But before I get into that, because I teach writing and because my students like stories, I'm going to start with a story. And this is a story about myself, but don't worry, I'm not going to talk about myself the whole time. But it's a story of how I came to study boredom. So when I was a teenager, every day after school, I would come home and this was in the wintertime. I grew up in Minnesota. I would come home and I would sit in front of the heater and I would blast it as hot as I could. I was always hot. I was always cold. And I would stare at the striped carpet and look longingly at my dog, who was usually out of arm's reach. It always smelled like burning dust. And I would sit there out for hours and hours at a time, just like bored out of my skull. And this went on for years and years, but it registers as in my memory as just one endless day. I sat there doing nothing, forcing myself to think about nothing, and it was excruciating. I hate nothing more than being bored, but I felt sort of paralyzed at that time. Now, why I did this is a longer story, and I won't get into it here, but I'll say that in part, I was in a bad situation I had literally no ability to get out of, and I didn't want to think about that. And I also was, for whatever reason, extremely boredom prone. All the things that they say about boredom prone people, I ended up doing. I left home as soon as I could. I took off on wild adventures. I literally walked across the United States. I traveled to Mexico during the Zapatista Revolution. I did a lot of drugs. I don't anymore, don't worry. I made a lot of reckless decisions, but every so often, honestly, quite often, boredom would Saul Bellow. This is one of my favorite boredom quotes. I'm sure we all have our favorite boredom quotes, but quite often, what Saul Bellow calls here that combination of stasis and anguish snuck in. And when it did, no matter what was happening, no matter what adventure I was on, if I was playing dominoes with the founder of the American Indian movement, which happened quite a lot for some reason for me, I felt just like I was still that kid in front of the heater. I was still bored out of my skull. I could still smell that dust burning, and then I would start running from it again. So many years later, when I was in my master's degree, learning how to teach, I was getting a certificate in the teaching of composition, and I read this line, and this is, we have much more boredom-focused scholars who have talked about boredom more articulately. This was one line in a pedagogy book, and she never talks about boredom in that book again. She's an amazing scholar. But this blew my mind. The word boredom, the word boring is heavily coded. That means, that is, it tends to have special significance for the one who uses it. Because my whole life, I'd known that I hated boredom. I knew I'd do anything in the world to escape it. And it had never occurred to me that I had no idea what boredom was. So that night, I looked up the word boredom, and I have been trying to figure out what it means for 18 years. I guess if you were at the conference yesterday, you'll know, and obviously everybody here probably knows, we don't have one definition of boredom that we can all agree on. Just yesterday, here are some of the definitions that we heard. So Sandy Mann said that boredom, and I'm sorry if I'm misquoting, these are things that I wrote down from the presentations yesterday. But yesterday we had Sandy Mann say boredom is a lack of stimulation and a desire to change. Erin Westgate talked about her MAC model, which I'm summarizing here. Boredom is the message that we want to be meaningfully engaged in something that matters. James Dankert talked about boredom as a desire to reach the Goldilocks zone of cognitive engagement. And he also referred to something he and Eastwood had written together, which is boredom as a crisis of agency. We heard the Leo Tolstoy quote, boredom as a desire for desires. I miscapitalized there. I can't remember who said this. This might have been Baba, but boredom as a compulsion to act, or a signal that drives us to act. And then we also saw a quote from Eastwood's paper on boredom and attention, which is that boredom is the uncomfortable feeling of wanting but being unable to engage in satisfying activity. And actually, there might have been more. I mean, I'm sure there were more that I missed. But the thing about this is, I believe all of these definitions, and I'll probably hear 10 more definitions today, and I will believe all of those definitions too. So as the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips wrote, clearly we should speak not of boredom, but of boredoms, because the notion itself includes a multiplicity of moods and feelings. The only thing I would disagree with here is that I'm not sure anything is quite clear about boredom. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to go back to this for a second. Here's the thing. This is a pedagogically significant rambling that I'm going on here. At the time I was reading about the multiple meanings of boredom for the first time, I was also teaching for pretty much the first time. I had taught some creative writing classes to high school students before, and that was very difficult. But anyway, I was teaching college for the first time. And as you might imagine, I know that there's this talk that students are more bored now or pay less attention than now. I don't know how we would gauge that. Although, Jenny, I did really appreciate your talk. But I've been teaching for 15 years. I'm not aware of a time that students were ever unbored. And when I was teaching for the first time, anytime a student made any gesture or any eye roll or anything that I interpreted as being boring, I was mortified, or being bored rather. I was mortified to think that I was boring someone, because I hated that feeling so much. And to think that I was the one initiating that feeling in a student horrified me, frankly horrified me. So I responded by trying to be the world's most exciting professor, which of course is probably bored them more and made it like terrible to be one of my students. Once I started being curious about boredom, I took the onus off myself as a professor. It's not, boredom, like attention, is an interaction between the student, the text, and the environment. I'm sorry, I'm talking about literacy here. So but it's the student, the situation, and so it's not just, there's not just one agent in boredom, it's an interaction. What I started to do is get curious about boredom, not just in myself, just sheer self-reflection is boring, but I started to ask students, when they said they were bored, I was like, oh, wow, really? What does that mean to you? What does that feel like? What do you do when you're bored? What is the antidote to boredom? Find me the place in this text where you got bored. What specifically bored you about this text? And the results were very interesting. This is all anecdotal. I have written papers about it. I did do more systematic questioning of students, and I'll talk about why that's less interesting to me than just getting students to have metacognitive awareness. And most often students responded with anger, not to the question, but to whatever was boring them. So this is far from what I used to think of as boredom. This is far from the deactivated apathy that I thought boredom was. Students were mostly angry. They said things like, this article has nothing to do with me. This isn't for me. This is stupid. Who the hell would want to read this? They would be furious. And, you know, I want to point out that everywhere I've taught, a lot of our students struggle with writing and with language issues. Now, I don't mean that they're not smart, and I would never say that, and I would be angry if anyone ever said that. But what I mean is they struggle with emotional and affective issues surrounding language. So they often have come from subpar K-12 educations, or they might, we sometimes call them second language issues, but English might be their third or fourth language. Or they might just not feel like they're smart. They might have been told they're not smart by not necessarily by their families, but by their schools or whatever. So what is happening is that they think, they'll tell me like, I'm the worst reader you've ever met, or I'm the worst writer you've ever met. To which I'll say, like, I would be very impressed if that were true. You know, like I don't, so there's an affective barrier to language, not to language and speaking, but to academic writing. And that comes up a lot when boredom is announced by students. So these are some of the things that would come up when students would metacognitively reflect on boredom. That they felt excluded, that they felt stupid or confused, that they were distracted by duress in their lives. Maybe they were hungry. Maybe they had some outside trauma. Obviously, I don't ask students to disclose trauma they're not comfortable with disclosing, but sometimes it came up. Obviously, it came up a lot during the pandemic here in New York, or every part of the world. Other attentional problems, maybe ADHD, maybe just other problems paying attention, distraction. I once had a student who had grown up in a neighborhood with high gun violence say, and I wrote about this many times, but how am I supposed to watch a little piece of paper when someone's supposed to be coming at me? That was his response. He said reading was boring. And I asked him what he meant. And he said, well, how am I supposed to watch a little piece of paper when someone might be coming at me? Sometimes they just say, well, my teacher always thinks I'm bored. So even though like they might be crossing their arms or have a facial expression that their teacher reads as boring. That could be a whole paper in and of itself. And certainly we could write a whole book on the performance of boredom. I had a whole slide on it, but I didn't want to run out of time. So this is like, someone might announce they're bored in a classroom when they're not actually bored. And that is a whole other thing, but that might be just to say, like, I don't want to do this, or this isn't, I'm not a part of the society that reads this book, or it's a way of separating yourself. That's an oversimplification, but I just want to clarify, one can perform boredom without being actually bored. They're separate, being bored and performing boredom. So it may be enlightening to do a quantitative study of the most frequent causes of boredom, or the emotions that correspond to boredom in the classroom. I would read that paper, but I wouldn't write that paper myself. That would be a long and arduous study. And to me, that's not what is most important about what I'm saying here. That's not what I'm arguing for here. What I'm arguing for here is that we get students to examine their own boredom closely, that we encourage students, especially boredom-prone students, as I used to be, to develop a metacognitive awareness of boredom. Now, I don't expect everyone to go on to study boredom for decades like I did or something like that, but just to listen to what boredom is trying to tell them. There are a few things that all of our definitions of boredom that I listed before have in common. Obviously, boredom is not curiosity or flow or total engagement, but it's important to understand that boredom is not disengagement either. If I don't want to read a book, I just don't read that book. But if I have to read a book for a class, or to be a part of a conversation with my friends, or because I think it's going to edify me in some way, like what if I went through life and I never read I think you could go through life without reading The Great Gatsby, but like what if I feel like I got to read that to fit in or something? And I still have trouble reading that book while I'm reading it. Now that book bores me. The things that bore us have their hooks in us. But for teachers, this is kind of good news, because it means that there's already a little spark, sometimes just a little, but there's already some desire to engage, some hook of engagement. Boredom, like pain, is a change signal. Like John Eastwood says, boredom lays down the gauntlet. It asks the agent, what do you need? What changes do you need to make now? What moves do you need to make now? How can you take back your own power? If students don't reflect on boredom, they might be missing out on some major opportunities for change. I want to be clear, like I said, boredom, like attention, is an interaction between student, environment, and situation. Boredom isn't the fault of the student alone. And sometimes students get a signal that they need to change, say, their socioeconomic status or their health or their living situation, things that are out of their hands. Sometimes they need to take back a power they're unable to take. I don't think that argues against a metacognitive awareness of boredom. It might argue for revolution, or major change of the structure of the university. And instructors can't always oversee those things. But yeah, 1 minute. But if they find students that respond to, if instructors find that students respond to boredom prompts with many feelings of helplessness, the professor can, at very least, change some of the structures of their classroom, and they can develop teaching methods that are more inclusive of students under, for example, duress. They can change their reading list to be more inclusive. There are changes that the instructor can make. The last thing I just want to say quickly is I thought I was going to be able to show you one of my interventions, by the way, and I have one. If people want to see it, you can email me. We have an intervention we do with our students. But anyway, I started this presentation off with the story of my life. And it's important that students are able to do that too, that they're able to tell their stories. I think outside the circle of boredom researchers or people that would come to the International Society of Boredom Studies, people sometimes think of boredom as an outlier and experience without qualities. And I forget who said that. That's something that's not part of the actual story, like a blip. But for me, that's not true. In fact, I just don't think that's the case. Boredom is a key part of everyone's story. And for me, boredom is where the story started. So that's what I had to say about that. Oh, thank you so much. And
Okay, thank you.
that's my info.
Okay, so we open a discussion, and maybe I have one comment that what you're saying is what I can confirm from Boredom studies, that in Boredom we have two components: listless component, yeah, and restless component. So yeah, this is against this natural definition, common definition of boredom, yeah, that this is apathy. So in this context, boredom is better than apathy. If you have apathetic students, there is no room for change, any hope. And if you have bored students, yeah, there is some part of them that wants to this change so eagerly that if teacher provides them with this change, yeah, there is hope for the class, for them to be reignited. Yeah.
Do you have a I know the apathy anhedonia article, but do you have an article that you could send to me on that?
Yeah, I will check it. Yeah,
Okay.
for sure I can send you something.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have another question? Any questions? I see nothing in the chat. Anyone? Okay. Yeah, I suppose this is also very important that you highlight this duress, that this could be some outside class events that highly influence the experience of boredom. Uh, yeah, this is also very nice. And could you explain maybe this metacognitive element, because I'm not quite sure I grasped it correctly.
Yeah, sorry. I thought I timed it at home and I thought I would have time to show, but basically what we do is we would have it has to do with those questions I was asking students, but what we would do is we would ask students, like they say, like, this reading is boring. This is so boring. And then instead of just saying like, oh yeah, that's boring, then we'd say like, okay, write about that. Write about what makes this reading boring. Get very specific. So first tell me, so they say the vocabulary is difficult. So just point me to a word that you find, like, where specifically are you bored in this text? Why specifically are you bored with this text? What, and get them to like write for, it can't be very long because they're bored, but write for 5 minutes about what specifically bores you about this text. Explain that to me, and then for 5 more minutes go to one particular place in the text and write specifically about what bores you in the text, so that they're really explaining, like getting to the heart of what they mean when they say they're bored, instead of just saying like, I'm bored and I know what boredom means, like digging deeper into what they mean when they say that they're bored. I hope that explained that. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, I think I get it. This metacognitive. Okay. Annie, you have a question.
I do. Thanks. Really interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I was just thinking about the responses that you kind of collated of the reasons that students gave why they found themselves bored in that type of situation. And I thought, do you reckon there is like in the responses that you found, they had a lot to do with like whether or not they're getting meaning out of things? I'm specifically thinking about that response that you said about, like concentrating on a piece of paper. If I, like I might get shot any moment, that kind of feeling of, like I'm not getting what I need for my life out of this.
Yeah, I mean, everything always, I shouldn't say everything always, but just like educational affect and tends to boil down, it's like peccary all over the place, but it's like tends to boil down to meaning and purpose. So like, and just like additional attentional difficulties. But like, so if and the thing about the little piece of paper, there's everything is in there, because you could just be that student just could be used to concentrating on his periphery, and so it's hard to concentrate on a piece of paper when he's used to concentrating on his periphery. That student, by the way, had a 4.0. He was at the college on a football scholarship, but he like surprised everyone by having a 4.0 in all of his classes, but he still like, you know, had a hard time concentrating. But also almost in every situation, the question of whether or not there's a purpose, a personal purpose and personal meaning for students who are struggling to engage, those are the ways to combat boredom. So, I mean, in my experience in the classroom. So that's the other thing that a metacognitive reflection can do, is get students to get closer to finding or creating a personal meaning for themselves, if that makes sense.
It does, definitely. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I suppose we reached the timeline of this session. So thank you very much, Carrie, for an interesting, inspiring presentation.